Hi, everyone. My name is Josh Bressers. I'm the Vice President of Security at a company called Anchore. We do next generation supply chain analysis. And I'm here today to talk to you about the basics of an SBOM. What is an SBOM? Do you need one? And kind of what does the future hold in that respect? So, without further ado, we'll just get cracking right into the presentation. And we'll just start with the simple question. What is an SBOM? This is something we hear about all the time. It's a software bill of materials, is what it stands for. I'm just going to use the word SBOM from this point forward. But fundamentally, what this is, and it's often been described as an ingredients list, right? This is something we're all very familiar with. Anyone who has any sort of food product you've ever interacted with, you've seen these food labels, and it talks about the ingredients that are in your food. And so we say, oh, and software bill of materials are the ingredients in your software. Because as we all know, software is made up of many ingredients. It's never just one thing. But this analogy isn't exactly accurate. It's not quite true in the real world, but it's especially not true in the world of software. And so when we look at this particular label, this is from a jar of spaghetti sauce that was actually in my basement. It was shockingly difficult to find a good food label on the internet. But this is a jar of spaghetti sauce and it contains tomatoes, right? Now, when we think of tomatoes, it seems pretty straightforward, right? Tomatoes, great. Okay, moving on. But here's the thing, this is a picture of tomatoes, and this is a picture of tomatoes, and this is a picture of tomatoes. And so the question you really have when you're talking about ingredients is what is the ingredient you're actually getting? In the case of food, we have hundreds of years at this point of, I guess, bad ingredients and regulations coming from governments and organizations and all kinds of places for what we're putting into our stuff. And in software, this is all really new. And so when we deal with the software world, it's not always obvious if we're dealing with, fresh tomatoes, canned tomatoes, rotten tomatoes in some instances. Kind of as a funny side note, I had a horrifying picture of bad tomatoes that I had to take out because I just couldn't stand it. But you get the idea, right? This is what we're dealing with when we talk about software bill of materials. What is in it? And so that's where we kind of start now of software, right? It's easy to talk about food and it's easy to use food as our example, but we're we're not dealing with food, right? We're dealing with software. So I have a little example here where I created a Node.js application. This is just a very simple web application that basically displays a website fundamentally. And I created there's a thing in the node universe called a package.json. And in that, I define 14 dependencies, right? Those are the things I need to run my application. And you think, okay, great. I have 14 things when we're talking about our bill of materials. These are the 14 things in my software. And it feels like it makes sense, right? But there's more to this story than just that. If you take the application I defined in that package JSON, the one we just saw, and we're going to refer back to that multiple times over this presentation. So keep it in mind. But if we take that and we install the dependencies, we actually get this picture right here. And this is a graph of all of the node packages that I need to run my very simple web app. And what we end up with is actually 162 things. So you think about this, 14 dependencies turned into 162 dependencies, right? This is not how food labels work. You don't add tomatoes to your product and get hundreds of other unexpected ingredients. Well, at least I hope you don't. But you get the idea, right? Food labels aren't necessarily an accurate description. This is a different way to think about software. And so the goal of the software bill of materials is to capture this, everything kind of lurking below the surface. I know there's always people love the iceberg analogy where what 10% of the iceberg is above the water and 90% of the iceberg is below. And sometimes open source software works in a very similar way. We have 14 things at the very top, and then we have a lot of things beneath it. So now that we kind of understand the basics, I want to explain like what is an SBOM? Like what actually is it? And there's an organization in the United States, the NTIA, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration. That's a mouthful. They created this thing they call the minimum fields for a software bill of materials. And this is the current list you're on the screen right now. I'm not going to read them because the details aren't necessarily important, but fundamentally, what we're capturing are things like who is the supplier of my software? What is the name of the software? What is the version of the software? What are the dependency relationships that my software has? And the idea behind this was they could define this minimum set of expectations, and then we could use that to drive the whole rest of the software bill of materials conversation and tooling and standards and everything that comes from there. Because you can imagine that anytime you're trying to work with any any group of people, it's easy to say, oh, we should have a software bill of materials. And if you send 10 people out to figure out what that means, you're going to get back at least 10 answers, probably more. And so the idea was that we need to set some expectations, and that's what the NTIA did. Now, recently, just due to the dynamics of the US government, CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, is now leading the charge around software bill of materials. So while the NTIA did this in the past, you want to look for CISA in the future, which is very exciting and very cool because they're doing some excellent work. Okay, so let's talk about SBOM data formats. There are three big ones you're going to see as you navigate this SBOM landscape, and they are SPDX, Cyclone DX, and something called SWID. SWID is not well used anymore. I left it on here because the IoT manufacturers still like SWID, but for our purposes, we're going to focus on SPDX and Cyclone DX for the rest of this conversation. SWID exists. I want to let you know it exists, and we will never talk about it again. But fundamentally, so you've got SPDX, which is part of the Linux Foundation, which is an kind of foundation filled with random open source things. Everything from the Linux kernel to the Open Source Security Foundation is part of that. And Cyclone DX is part of OWASP, which is the secure software development organization that's been around for a very, very long time. But fundamentally, these are not just like two random projects. These are supported and funded by actual good, real foundations. And they have enormous communities behind them with tons and tons of tooling behind them. And the one other thing I'm going to say, and depending upon who you ask, you may not get this answer, but these formats are functionally the same for our purposes. Anytime anyone talks about SBOM and they ask about SPDX or Cyclone DX, there is functionally no significant difference between the two formats. They accomplish the same thing. Certain tooling only works with certain formats, and that's fine. But from our perspective, we're just going to pretend they're the same. And that it makes our life much easier. So now, even though we have two formats, there are different ways to represent all of those formats. And I've got a couple examples on the screen. We'll look at some of this in a little more depth shortly. But these data outputs are on the screen. We've got something called like a table format or a tag value format. Those are the things on the left. Those are very human-focused outputs. They can be read by computers, but ideally, the intention is we're going to display information in a way a human can view it and understand it and extract value from it, versus the things on the right, which in those examples, it's JSON and XML. If you've ever looked at a JSON document or an XML document, you know very quickly these are not things for human beings. And that's the intent. The intention is not to have humans reading JSON, reading XML, trying to parse it. The intention is we take these software bill of materials in these formats for computers, and we use them in other computerized systems that can do certain automation, which is really cool and it's really exciting. There are also different types of SBOMs. And this is where we start kind of getting into the weeds a little bit. But this is a really important point, and this is a really important aspect of software bill of materials. Because when someone says, do you have an SBOM? Well, what does that mean? Because I can create an SBOM of a source repository, which in the case of my NPM application is going to be 14 things. Or I could take an SBOM of my built application, which is going to be 162 things. Or I can take my application and I can put it in a container. And now it's even more things because now I have an operating system on top of that. And I have the Node.js runtime on top of that. And so you can see how this kind of expands. It can get even more interesting because, for example, when I go to deploy the application, I might add configuration details or modify something about the installed container image to accommodate my deployment system. And so now it's something else that's different. And so I can scan for an SBOM every step of the way, right? I can ask questions like what changed between my source code stage and my build stage? What changed between my build and what I deployed? And there's even instances where after I deploy, the container might change. I mean, it's there's the old trope of don't SSH into your containers, but everyone knows it totally happens all the time. And so now the question becomes, well, did someone SSH in and change something? Let's scan it. Let's find out. Let's ask these questions. And so this is where we can take our picture from a little while ago, put it on top of this, and now we can think about, okay, we had these 14 things. What happened? How is it different? How has it changed? And it gets even more complicated because if we look at this picture, for example, we see the very first thing, Quasar Extras 1.0.0, right? We might think 1.0.0 is getting installed in our application, but what that little caret sign actually means is it says you can install any version of this package from 1.0.0 up to 2.0.0, but you can't install anything in the 2.x series. So I might think I'm getting 1.0.0, but I might get 1.0.1. And it gets even more complicated because I might install 1.0.1 today, and then I might do some more development and I might reinstall all the updates. I might get version 1.0.2. So you can see why these different types are actually a really important aspect of dealing with SBOMs and how they all fit together. All right, so let's recap everything. That was really fast. I feel like that was drinking from the fire hose, but that's okay because we're going to get to the good stuff after this. So, kind of what is an SBOM, right? Software in our projects, dependencies of dependencies of dependencies, dependencies all the way down. There's a mantra in the open source world I really like that says, if you ship it, you support it. Just because something is a dependency of a dependency of a dependency doesn't mean we can wash our hands of it and say, not my problem. It's in your software. You have to deal with it. And that's the reality of that. We've got our minimum fields that were defined by the NTIA. Now CISA is working on that. We have SPDX and CycloneDX. Remember, we're not talking about the third one. JSON format, XML format, human formats, and there's CSV. There's tons of formats. There's tons of ways to represent these. But again, it's not important. What's important is just understanding CycloneDX, SPDX. Those are the formats you're going to hear about. And there's the different types of SBOMs. Again, source, build, runtime, deploy, whatever. Again, the details aren't necessarily important. What's important is to understand that you could have different kinds of SBOMs for the same project, and that's okay. It doesn't mean anything is wrong. It doesn't mean anything bad is happening. It's just how to do it. Okay, so now let's move on to how to create an SBOM. You could do it manually. Don't do that. A long time ago, I'm very old. So in the early days, we actually kept track of this kind of stuff in spreadsheets and text files. It was terrible. So I'm just putting it here to anyone who suggests doing this manually is they're setting themselves up for failure. Because as we know, we might write down 14 things, but we are going to miss hundreds of other things if we do that. And I will say going from 14 to 162 node packages is actually a pretty reasonable increase. You'll often see it into the thousands. So like NPM is a good example where you get dependency explosion. So the better way to create SBOMs is to use a tool, right? There is an enormous number of open source scanners that can take container images and source repositories and whatever, zip files, you name it. And they can scan it and they can look for the contents of it. And this is where, like I've listed a couple on there, Sift, Trivy, Turn. The picture on the right is from Sift. That's the tool I work on at Anchore. It's open source. Anyone can run it. It's free. We see a table format at the output. And I purposely scanned a small thing so we could fit it all. That's just Alpine Linux. It's very tiny, but you get the idea. You run this against a container, you get a result. Very, very easy. No big deal. And that's great. You're going to hear people that might say, oh, but the automated scanners miss things. And that is absolutely correct. However, you have to start somewhere. And I think in the world of security, we are notorious for trying to say if something isn't perfect, it's terrible. It is not terrible. It is okay to start and get better because if your goal is perfection, you will never start. And so this is one of those instances where look at the tools that exist. They're free, they're good. Give them a whirl. Now, if we look at our sift run from the previous slide, we can also output in different formats. And this is kind of the power of some of these tools, because you might have a customer saying, I want an SPDX format SBOM. You might have a customer saying, I want a CycloneDX format SBOM. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter, because you can output any of these formats. These tools support XML, JSON, CycloneDX, SPDX. They can convert between the two, and that's great, and that's what you want. So again, we can just completely take out the format question from our equation, and we can let the tooling do the heavy lifting for us in this instance, and that's exactly the right thing to do. So now I built an SBOM. What do I do? And this is where things start to get a little more shaky in the story. Remember, software bill of materials, they're really new. Like, we've only been working on this stuff for a couple of years in the context we're using. So there's not tons of tooling that can do things. I mean, Cloudsmith can help you manage SBOMs. Anchore can help you manage SBOMs. There's a tool like Dependency Track from OWASP that can help you manage SBOMs. And for some of us, that's the right answer. And for some of us, it's not. And there is nothing wrong with taking an SBOM and putting it in a folder. That sounds foolish, like, oh, why would I do this and keep it? But there are reasons to hang on to these things. We're going to talk about those on the next slide. But fundamentally, there is no shame in just taking this thing and shoving it in a folder. That's okay. Don't feel bad if you do that. So what do we actually do with these things? Today, now this is very focused on today. There's some future coming after this, but today, the single most valuable use of a software bill of materials is vulnerability scanning. And what this means is I take my SBOM and I look at all the packages in it, and I can say, what are the security vulnerabilities we know about in the packages in my software? And so this can find things like Log4Shell is a great example. You can look at your software and say, what am I affected by? And it can be a huge list of things. And the beauty of having SBOMs for this is a lot of scanners will say, open up a container, and they dig around in the container and they figure out what's there. And then once they know it's there, they can tell you what the vulnerabilities are. But this can take time, because obviously digging around and unpacking a container image is not fast. But if you have a software bill of materials, you get to skip that step because you did it once. So now you can scan your SBOM for vulnerabilities very, very quickly, usually in milliseconds versus seconds or tens of seconds or maybe minutes, depending upon the size of the artifact you're scanning. That is very exciting and interesting. So now, instead of doing a vulnerability scan every day, you can vulnerability scan 100 times a day, and it costs nothing, which is awesome. License compliance is something that's used today. In fact, that's kind of the birth of SBOM, was license compliance. When you use open source software comes with a license. That license tells you what your rights and obligations are to that software. And so your legal team might say, what are all the open source licenses we're using? And you might think, we're only using 14 projects, so we're just going to list the 14 licenses there. Actually, you have a lot more than 14 things. And so this is where you can use an SBOM to capture the licenses and all of that stuff. And then you can ask questions about, what are the licenses I have, right? And then lastly, there are unknown reasons we need an SBOM. And what I mean by that is, you might have a customer say, give me your SBOM. And you might be like, why? It's like, I don't care. Give me an SBOM. You can have regulators telling you, you need an SBOM. That's coming. We're going to talk about regulation momentarily, but there are going to be other reasons this happens. And sometimes that's a good enough reason, right? You don't always need some great technical purpose. If you have market pressures to do something, you're going to do it. And I think that's something we're seeing today in the world of SBOM. And now let's talk about the future of SBOM. So I think the most interesting thing we're going to see very soon is just management systems. And again, this goes back to things like Anchore and Cloudsmith already do this. But as we use more SBOMs, as we see more and more customer asks, more and more internal asks, more and more tooling designed to work with this stuff, we have to manage it. I know I told you to put your SBOMs in a directory in a file server, but that doesn't scale. I mean, as soon as you get more than probably 20 or 30 files in that directory, it becomes a mess and you can't find anything. And this is where management systems are going to make a huge difference for all of us trying to deal with this, because now, instead of worrying about where are my SBOMs, who's getting which SBOMs, which particular software package does its SBOM apply to. You just stick them all in a system and it figures it out for you, which is great. I mean, this is this is the job of IT, right? We take annoying, repetitive problems and we make them easy. So keep an eye out for management systems. They're very close, and I think we're going to see a lot more of them in the very, very near future. Artifact discovery is coming for certain. And I don't mean just artifact discovery in the context of like knowing what's in an SBOM. I mean wide scale. And this is kind of tied to the management systems. But one of my favorite stories I have is around Log4Shell. We all know what Log4Shell was. It was probably one of the single biggest security events any of us have lived through up to this point. And it ruined many, many Christmases. Goodness knows it ruined mine. And so basically what happened though is the thing that made Log4Shell so tricky is Log4j was a Java package, and Java packages can be installed on a disk, or other Java packages can contain Java packages. So like you have a jar, and inside the jar is another jar, and inside that jar is another jar. And you can imagine this can go several layers deep. And so our challenge with Log4Shell was figuring out how to unwrap all this stuff and really go deep into these archives. And this is where SBOM scanners made a difference. So I know of a company that was using an SBOM scanner to scan all of their infrastructure. They had an SBOM management system that was logging all of that infrastructure. And so when Log4Shell hit, they went to the search box in their SBOM management platform. They typed in Log4j, and it gave them the list of everything they needed to go look at. And so instead of taking 3 months to figure out where Log4j was, it took them 3 minutes. And that's the kind of stuff that really makes SBOMs very powerful. And what's even more exciting is you can look back in time. And so you can say, did we ever run Log4j? And you might say, it's not running in any infrastructure we have today, but we were running it in this Kubernetes cluster 6 months ago. You can't answer that without a historical archive. And SBOMs are files that make it very, very easy to go back in time and take a look at what was there, which is awesome. Distribution. Now, what I mean by this is let's pretend there's a world where we're all creating SBOMs. Everyone has SBOMs for all their software, which isn't going to happen, of course, but let's pretend there is. And so now we have to think about ways to move the SBOMs around. And what I mean by that is, let's say I have an application and I want to give you my SBOM. How do I do that? Today, it's going to go in an email that I send to you, and that's kind of silly. Long term, we have to think about ways to distribute these things. There's work going on right now. For example, what about putting packages, or what about putting the SBOM inside the actual package, like the npm package I install? What if there was an actual SBOM inside of it? The container image I'm shipping, what if we put the SBOM in the container registry itself and you can download it? What if I had a special place on my website, like we've got our robots.txt that all the websites have? What if we had a similar thing where I know I can go find your SBOM by going to this URL, 100%. Now, this also opens up questions for things like trust and attestation, and those are really hard problems to solve. And it's being worked on, but the thing that gives me hope here is just the fact that it's coming, and there are really smart people putting a lot of effort into this. And then, of course, there's something called VEX, which I'm going to toss in here as future of SBOM, even though it's not technically SBOM. VEX is called Vulnerability Exploitability Exchange. And what this is all of our software has vulnerabilities. Some of those vulnerabilities are going to be false positives for a variety of reasons. It could be, I'm not actually shipping that package. I'm not shipping that version of a package. The code in question can't be reached. There's a million reasons, right? I'm not going to go into all the details, but what we're going to see is this technology called VEX lives next to SBOMs. It suffers from the same distribution problem as an SBOM does, but it's going to come up, and it's very exciting. It could fill a multi-hour talk all by itself, but just kind of keep your eye on this. And when you see it, it's fundamentally a way for us to take an SBOM, scan the SBOM for vulnerabilities, apply the VEX knowledge on top of that to filter out the vulnerabilities that don't actually affect me, and get an accurate, good list of security vulnerabilities that affect my product. And that is very exciting, because today, if you scan your product for vulnerabilities, you're going to get a certain number of false positives, and it's very frustrating for your security team. As a person on a security team, I assure you, it's very, very frustrating. And then for future of SBOM, the last thing is regulation and compliance. This is coming. Like, I can't stress this enough that the governments of the world are going to make this happen, whether we want it to or not. The FDA in the United States, the Food and Drug Administration, is legally obligated to require SBOMs today. It was in the omnibus bill that was passed a couple months ago. We're seeing the SSDF from NIST that's demanding these things. The National Defense Authorization Act had SBOM language in it. It got pulled, but one of these years it's going to stick. Like, regulation is coming. So if for no other reason, this is why you should pay attention to this topic, because once the regulators say you have to do this, a lot of large organizations are going to fall in line, and it's just going to be the way it is. So if you get nothing else out of this talk, take this slide away and just say, like, the regulators are going to tell us we have to do this. So there's also a question of kind of, what do SBOMs not do? And I think this is important because many times when SBOMs are used in a conversation, it feels like whatever your problem is, an SBOM will solve it. And that's not true at all, right? They have a very specific purpose. SBOMs don't exist to exist. SBOMs are a tool to solve other problems. And I think that's something we forget sometimes, especially in the tech fervor that we're all surrounded by all the time. So fundamentally, right, SBOMs don't tell you about risk. They don't do that. They just tell you what's in a thing. It's your job to figure out risk. They don't give you any vulnerability details. You have to take an SBOM and scan it for vulnerabilities. That's how this worked. Again, that's kind of part of the risk conversation, right? SBOMs are static. SBOMs don't change. And that's the thing. There will be new vulnerabilities come out tomorrow that will affect your software, but the SBOM tomorrow will be the same SBOM today because the software hasn't changed. Now, you release a new version, you release a new SBOM, but the actual thing in the version you release today is it. It doesn't change. That's how it works. All right. I'll never need an SBOM, right? Yeah, you will, probably. And I think, again, we kind of come back to regulation and customers and insurance, and it's going to be external factors that really push us into this. There are things you can do with the tools, but fundamentally, external forces are what are going to drive this. And so you can say, I'll never need to do this. I don't have to pay attention. I don't care. I am promising you the external market forces are going to make you care whether you want to or not. So you can start paying attention now, or you can turn it into an emergency in 6 months, which we'll see. We'll see how that goes. And so we're going to finish up now with, like, what can you do right now? This is something you can go and do today, right? Go get a scanner, create SBOMs, and not even necessarily to do anything with them, but to learn. Learn how these things work. It's not hard to use. These scanners are good enough. They do their job. Go find them, run them, try them, put the SBOMs in a folder, right? We've been over this. It's very easy. Ask your vendors for SBOMs. And again, this isn't necessarily for like some grand purpose. It's to see what they do. Mature vendors will be able to talk to you about this intelligently. Immature vendors won't. It's going to be an easy way to understand, what does my vendor do? What are they doing? And again, when you get them, put them in a folder. I think expect to distribute SBOMs. So start thinking about the problem. How are we going to distribute these? Where are we going to keep them? Who's going to be responsible? Like, you can do that today. You don't have to answer it. You can just ask the questions. And then, of course, getting ready for the next major event. There is going to be another event like Log4Shell. It is just the reality. It's going to happen. We can start preparing for it, and SBOMs are one of the many ways. So that's it. I mean, it's a very simple overview, some very simple to-dos, but I think this is one of those things that with a little bit of attention and purpose, it can really go a long way.